Let's raise a glass to Margaret's upcoming vacation in a nursing home, Ashley said with a bright smile, lifting her champagne flute as if she were announcing a cruise to the Bahamas instead of exile. The dining room fell into that strange, delicate silence that only families understand, the kind wrapped in forced laughter and the clink of crystal against crystal. Daniel gave a small chuckle, not quite meeting his mother's eyes. Around the long oak table, decorated with pale pink peonies and neatly folded linen napkins, a few guests shifted in their chairs. It was Mother's Day. Sunlight filtered through the wide kitchen windows of Daniel and Ashley's suburban home in Fairfield County, Connecticut, casting warm stripes across the polished hardwood floors. Margaret Whitmore, 72 years old, sat at the end of the table, her back straight, her silver hair swept neatly into a low chignon. She had driven 40 minutes that morning in her well-maintained Lexus, bringing a homemade lemon pound cake wrapped carefully in parchment and ribbon. She had worn her soft blue cardigan because Lily once told her it made her look elegant, like someone in an old movie. She did not flinch when the word nursing home floated across the table like a casual afterthought. Instead, she set her fork down beside her untouched slice of roast chicken and folded her hands in her lap. The peonies smelled sweet. Someone cleared their throat. Ashley took a sip of champagne, eyes sparkling as though she had delivered a clever joke. "Oh, don't look so serious," she added lightly. "We all know it's just about planning ahead." Margaret gave a small nod. Planning ahead. She had spent most of her adult life doing exactly that. She and Robert had built their colonial-style home 30 years ago, measuring every beam and choosing every fixture with care. She had balanced budgets, hosted holidays, paid for piano lessons and orthodontics in Daniel's first used car. Planning ahead was something she understood intimately. What she did not understand was why her name had not appeared on the handmade Mother's Day place cards scattered around the table. Ashley had crafted one for herself, best mom ever, in looping gold ink. There was one for Daniel's sister-in-law, who had recently had a baby. There were pastel cards for the younger mother's present. Margaret's place setting had only a folded napkin. She noticed these things quietly. The way she noticed that the framed family photo on the hallway console now featured Daniel, Ashley, and Lily standing on a Cape Cod beach last summer without her. She had been there that weekend. She remembered holding Lily's sandals while the girl ran toward the tide. Somehow, she had been cropped out. "Mom, you know we worry about you being alone in that big house," Daniel said now, pushing his plate aside. His tone was gentle, almost rehearsed. "It's not safe forever." Margaret looked at her son, at the faint lines around his eyes that had deepened in recent years. She saw Robert's jaw in him. She saw her own reflection in the shape of his hands. "I managed just fine," she replied evenly. She did not raise her voice. She did not remind him that she still walked 2 miles every morning through her neighborhood, that she attended a book club twice a month, that she had friends who checked in regularly. She did not mention that she handled her own investments and had never once missed a property tax payment. Instead, she reached for her water glass and took a measured sip. Lily, seated across from her, stared down at her plate. The teenager's fingers tightened around her fork. Margaret noticed that too. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked in steady rhythm. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded ordinary. And yet something had shifted. Margaret felt it the way one feels a sudden drop in temperature before a summer storm. She had come expecting a simple meal, perhaps a card, perhaps even a hug. Instead, she had been offered a toast to her disappearance. She smiled then, not brightly, not bitterly, just enough to signal that she had heard every word and would not crumble under it. Inside, a quiet resolve began to take shape, careful and precise, like the first draft of a blueprint. Planning ahead, she thought, had always been her specialty. Margaret remained seated until the laughter thinned into ordinary conversation and plates began to empty. And when she finally rose to carry her dish to the kitchen island, she moved with the same steady grace she had practiced for decades at church potlucks and neighborhood dinners. Her shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The kitchen smelled of garlic and rosemary, and sunlight flashed against the stainless steel appliances that Ashley had insisted were necessary during last year's renovation. Margaret placed her serving tray beside the sink and noticed that the cabinet above the refrigerator stood slightly open, revealing a stack of glossy brochures with soft beige covers. She would not have looked twice if one had not slipped forward just enough for the words Premier Senior Living Communities to catch her eye. She did not touch it. She did not need to. The image of manicured lawns and rocking chairs on a wide veranda was clear enough from where she stood. Behind her, Daniel was explaining something about property taxes rising again in their town, his voice low and practical. "It is just a matter of planning responsibly," he said. Ashley agreed quickly, adding that many facilities offered wonderful social calendars, yoga classes, even shuttle buses to shopping centers within 5 miles. Margaret rinsed her hands under warm water and dried them carefully with a monogrammed towel. Planning responsibly. The phrase echoed softly. She remembered sitting at her own kitchen table nearly 30 years earlier, calculating mortgage payments down to the dollar, making sure Daniel could attend a summer science program that cost more than she had ever spent on herself. She had never considered that one-day planning might mean being discussed like a project instead of a person. When she returned to the dining room, Lily's eyes met hers briefly. The girl looked unsettled, her usual teenage composure replaced by something closer to worry. Margaret gave her a small, reassuring nod. She did not want the child to feel caught between loyalties. The meal wound down slowly. Dessert was served, though Margaret's lemon cake remained mostly untouched. Ashley complimented it politely, saying it tasted just like something from a bakery in town, the kind of compliment that sounded kind but created distance at the same time. Daniel checked his phone more than once. Margaret noticed that he stepped outside to take a call, lowering his voice as he paced near the back patio. She watched through the sliding glass door as he gestured toward the house, toward the dining room, toward her. When he came back in, he smiled too quickly. "Mom, we just want what is best for you," he said again, as if repetition could soften the edges. Margaret folded her napkin neatly beside her plate. She asked. No questions. She made no accusations. Instead, she observed. She noted how easily the topic resurfaced, how seamlessly Ashley steered it, how Daniel nodded along with a mixture of guilt and relief. She understood something now that she had not allowed herself to see before. This was not a spontaneous joke made over champagne. This was a conversation that had already taken place, perhaps many times, in rooms where she was not present. As the afternoon light began to fade and guests gathered their handbags and car keys, Margaret retrieved her purse from the hallway bench. She paused for a moment in front of the framed family photograph. Her absence in that image felt deliberate now, not accidental. She straightened the frame gently and turned toward the door. Ashley hugged her lightly, a brief embrace that never quite settled. Daniel promised to call during the week. Margaret stepped outside into the mild spring air, the scent of freshly cut grass lingering along the driveway. She walked to her car without hurry. When she closed the driver's side door, the quiet inside felt honest. She rested her hands on the steering wheel and allowed herself one slow breath. The day had revealed more than anyone intended, and Margaret, who had spent a lifetime planning carefully, began to consider what planning ahead might look like this time. The drive home felt longer than 40 minutes, though the highway signs and familiar exits passed in their usual order, and Margaret kept both hands steady on the steering wheel as late afternoon lights stretched across the pavement in pale gold bands. She did not turn on the radio. She preferred the quiet, the low hum of the engine and the distant rush of other cars moving at 70 miles per hour, because silence left room for memory. Over the past 6 months there had been small moments she had brushed aside, tiny details that now aligned with unsettling precision. Daniel insisting on reviewing her homeowner insurance policy one evening under the pretense of helping her find a better rate. Ashley asking casual questions about how often she forgot to take her vitamins. A sudden interest in whether she had ever considered granting medical power of attorney just in case. At the time, Margaret had answered patiently, even gratefully, believing their concern came from love. Now, each question felt measured, strategic. When she pulled into her driveway, the white Colonial stood exactly as it always had, shutters freshly painted last spring, the maple tree in the front yard just beginning to bloom. She sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, looking at the house Robert had designed on the back of a yellow legal pad at their kitchen table decades earlier. He had insisted on wide hallways and solid oak floors, saying a home should feel strong beneath your feet. Margaret walked up the brick path and unlocked the door, the familiar scent of lemon polish greeting her. Inside, everything was orderly. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains in the living room. Nothing suggested that she was fragile or incapable. She set her purse down and moved slowly through the house, touching the back of a chair, straightening a framed photograph, adjusting a throw pillow that did not need adjusting. On the kitchen counter lay her mail from the previous day. She sorted through envelopes with calm efficiency until one caught her attention. It was a bank statement addressed not only to her, but also copied to Daniel's email, a detail she did not remember authorizing. She read the fine print carefully, her brow tightening only slightly. Weeks earlier, Daniel had offered to help her set up online access, claiming it would make bill payments easier. She had trusted him with her password. She stood very still in the center of the kitchen, the paper resting lightly in her hands. Trust, she realized, was not a single decision but a series of small openings. She walked to the study and opened the top drawer of Robert's old mahogany desk. Inside were neatly organized folders labeled in his precise handwriting. Estate documents, insurance policies, investment accounts. She had not needed to consult them since his passing 3 years ago, yet she had kept everything exactly as he left it. She lifted the folder marked estate documents and placed it on the desk, running her fingers over the cover before opening it. The will named her as primary beneficiary, with Daniel and his sister listed after her. There were clauses about competency and guardianship, language she had once skimmed without concern. Now she read each line slowly, absorbing every word. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the street. A neighbor's dog barked twice and then fell quiet. The world moved on, unaware of the shift occurring in Margaret's understanding. She sat down in Robert's old leather chair and allowed herself a single measured breath. The pattern was no longer subtle. Questions about her memory, access to her accounts, brochures hidden in kitchen cabinets, casual jokes wrapped in polite smiles. None of it was accidental. Margaret closed the folder carefully and returned it to its place. She did not feel panic. She felt clarity. For years, she had been the one anticipating storms before clouds formed. It appeared that skill would be necessary again. She turned off the kitchen light as evening settled outside and began considering which call she would make first in the morning. Margaret woke before sunrise the next morning, a habit formed over decades of early school mornings and quiet hours shared with Robert at the kitchen table, and she lay still for a moment listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a delivery truck passing along Maple Ridge Road. The house did not feel too large. It felt steady. She rose, tied her robe securely at the waist, and moved through her morning routine with deliberate calm. Coffee brewed in the same stainless steel machine she and Robert had purchased 10 years earlier during a 4th of July sale. She poured a cup, added a measured splash of cream, and carried it into the study. The folder labeled estate documents remained exactly where she had placed it the night before. Margaret sat down and opened her laptop, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. She searched for the contact information of Thomas Green, the attorney who had drafted Robert's will. His office was located just 12 miles away in downtown Stamford, a place Margaret had driven to countless times for errands and appointments. She dialed the number printed on the website and waited through 2 rings before a receptionist answered. Margaret's voice was clear and steady as she requested an appointment to review her estate plan. She did not explain why. She did not need to. The earliest available time was Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning. She accepted without hesitation. After ending the call, she closed the laptop and looked around the study. The bookshelves were lined with hardcover novels, tax binders, and framed photographs that marked milestones of a life carefully built. There was Daniel at age 8 holding a Little League trophy nearly as tall as his arm. There was Lily as a toddler, gripping Margaret's finger on a sandy Cape Cod beach. Margaret stood and walked to the window, watching as sunlight gradually spread across the lawn. She thought about the brochures in Ashley's cabinet, about the subtle shift in Daniel's tone over recent months, about the shared bank statement she had never agreed to share. None of it had happened overnight. It had unfolded quietly, layered beneath polite conversations and family dinners. She returned to the desk and retrieved her phone once more, scrolling through her recent messages. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel had texted asking if she had ever considered simplifying her finances. Last month, Ashley had sent a link to an article about senior safety. Margaret had responded kindly to both. She had believed they were being thoughtful. Now she saw coordination where she had once seen coincidence. She opened a small leather notebook she kept for household records and wrote down 3 simple lines. Review estate plan. Remove shared access. Confirm medical directives. The act of writing steadied her. It reminded her that she was not drifting without control. She was assessing, adjusting, preparing. After breakfast, she changed into walking shoes and stepped outside for her usual 2-mile route through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the sky a clean blue without a cloud in sight. Neighbors waved as they tended gardens or retrieved newspapers from driveways. Mrs. Langley from 3 houses down called out that Margaret looked wonderful for her age. Margaret smiled politely and thanked her, but she did not dwell on the compliment. She focused instead on the rhythm of her steps against the pavement, the strength in her legs, the clarity in her mind. She was not confused. She was not incapable. She was aware. By the time she returned home, a plan had begun to take shape with the same quiet precision she had used for every major decision in her life. If Daniel and Ashley believed planning ahead meant preparing to move her aside, they had underestimated the woman who had managed a household budget through recessions, who had balanced checkbooks to the cent, who had navigated loss without surrendering her footing. Margaret stepped back inside, locked the door behind her, and placed her keys carefully in the ceramic bowl. By the entryway, Thursday at 10 o'clock would be the first step. And this time, she would be the one directing the conversation. Thursday arrived with a pale gray sky and a steady breeze that rustled the budding branches along Main Street as Margaret drove toward Stamford with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her posture upright and composed as though she were heading to a routine luncheon rather than a meeting that might redefine the structure of her family. She arrived 10 minutes early and parked in a metered space directly across from Thomas Green's brick office building, feeding the meter with exact change and smoothing the front of her navy blazer before stepping inside. The reception area smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, and framed certificates lined the walls in orderly rows. When Thomas emerged to greet her, his expression was warm but perceptive, the look of a man who had spent decades reading between lines that clients did not always speak aloud. Margaret shook his hand firmly and followed him into his office, settling into a leather chair across from his desk. She placed her folder neatly on the polished surface and folded her hands over it. Thomas asked how she had been managing since Robert's passing, and Margaret answered honestly that she had adjusted well. She described her daily walks, her book club, her independence. She did not dramatize. She did not complain. Then she explained that she wished to review her estate documents, specifically any clauses regarding competency, guardianship, and access to financial accounts. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as he retrieved a copy of the original will from his filing cabinet. He adjusted his glasses and pointed to a section outlining procedures should Margaret ever be declared unable to manage her affairs. This requires formal medical evaluation, he said carefully. It cannot be initiated casually. Margaret absorbed the information in silence. She then asked whether granting shared online access to her accounts could be reversed. Thomas confirmed that it could, and he recommended updating her digital permissions immediately. Margaret nodded again, her expression steady. She explained that her son had recently taken an interest in her financial organization, and while she appreciated the gesture, she preferred full privacy moving forward. Thomas did not press for details. Instead, he suggested drafting an addendum that clearly specified that no transfer of authority could occur without Margaret's direct written consent witnessed in person at his office. He also proposed updating her healthcare directive to reinforce her autonomy. Margaret felt a subtle shift inside her, not fear but alignment, as if scattered pieces were returning to their rightful places. She agreed to the revisions and scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week to finalize signatures. When the meeting concluded, Thomas walked her to the door and assured her that careful planning often prevented unnecessary conflict. Margaret stepped back onto the sidewalk with a quiet sense of steadiness. The breeze had strengthened slightly, lifting strands of her silver hair, but she did not rush to her car. Instead, she paused and looked up at the sky, considering how easily assumptions could form when left unchallenged. On the drive home, she stopped at her bank branch, a modest building with a blue awning and familiar tellers who greeted her by name. She requested the removal of shared digital access and reset her passwords in person, declining assistance beyond what was required. The young teller smiled politely, unaware that this simple administrative action carried weight far beyond its appearance. By late afternoon, Margaret was back in her kitchen, placing a folder of updated documents into the drawer of Robert's mahogany desk. The house felt neither threatened nor fragile. It felt secure. As evening approached, her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel asking whether she had thought more about simplifying her living situation. Margaret read the message twice before setting the phone down on the counter without replying. She did not feel urgency. She felt timing. And she knew that when she chose to answer, it would not be with uncertainty. Daniel called the following evening just after 7 o'clock, his name lighting up Margaret's phone while she was rinsing a teacup at the kitchen sink, and she dried her hands carefully before answering, her voice composed and warm as though nothing beneath the surface had shifted at all. He asked about her day first, about the weather in her neighborhood, about whether she had finished the mystery novel she mentioned the previous week. Margaret responded evenly, describing her morning walk and the way the maple tree in her front yard had begun to show brighter green leaves. She did not mention the attorney's office. She did not mention the bank. After a brief pause, Daniel cleared his throat and returned to the subject that had lingered between them since Sunday. He said he had been researching communities that offered a safer environment and more social opportunities, his tone careful, persuasive. Margaret listened without interrupting. She could almost hear Ashley's phrasing woven into his sentences. Words like convenient and supportive and maintenance-free drifted through the call with polished softness. Margaret moved to the kitchen table and sat down, folding one hand over the other as she had done in the lawyer's office. "I appreciate your concern," she said calmly, allowing the silence afterward to stretch just long enough for Daniel to feel it. He continued, explaining that he and Ashley had toured a facility only 15 minutes from their home. He described landscaped courtyards, on-site dining, transportation to medical appointments within a 10-mile radius. He spoke as though the decision were already halfway made. Margaret asked a single question. "When were you planning to tell me about the tour?" The line went quiet for 2 full seconds. Daniel replied that they had not wanted to worry her unnecessarily. Margaret absorbed that. Not wanting to worry her had translated into not including her. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply said that she had met with her attorney to review her estate documents and that all of her directives were current and clear. She spoke the sentence without emphasis, yet its meaning settled firmly between them. Daniel hesitated, then asked why she would need to review those documents. Margaret answered that planning responsibly had always been important to her. The phrase returned now with deliberate calm. She reminded him that she remained fully capable of managing her home, her finances, and her health decisions. She added that any future changes would be initiated by her, not arranged around her. On the other end of the line, Daniel's tone shifted subtly, no longer confident but searching. He assured her that everything they were doing came from love. Margaret believed that, at least partially, love could coexist with convenience. Love could blur into control when left unchecked. She ended the call gently, wishing him a good night and asking him to give Lily her affection. After setting the phone down, she remained seated for a moment, listening to the quiet house. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Outside, a car passed and faded into the distance. Margaret rose and walked to the study, opening the drawer where she had placed the updated documents. She reviewed the notes from her meeting and added one more line in her leather notebook. "Invite them here. Transparency in my home." The idea settled comfortably in her mind. If conversations were going to unfold about her future, they would unfold across her own dining table, under her own roof, where the walls carried decades of memory and not a single decision had ever been made without her voice. She closed the notebook and turned off the desk lamp, the room dimming softly around her. For the first time since Sunday, she felt no uncertainty. The pieces were aligning, and she intended to set the next scene herself. Margaret chose Saturday evening for the dinner, not because it was convenient, but because it carried weight, and she called Daniel midweek to invite him, Ashley, and Lily to her house at 6 o'clock sharp, her tone pleasant and unmistakably certain as she mentioned that she had something important to discuss. Daniel hesitated only briefly before agreeing. and Ashley's voice could be heard faintly in the background asking what the occasion was, to which Margaret replied simply that it was time for clarity. The days leading up to Saturday moved with quiet purpose. Margaret polished the dining table that Robert had built by hand 32 years earlier, its oak surface still smooth beneath her fingertips. She prepared a simple but thoughtful menu: roasted chicken with fresh herbs from her garden, green beans with sliced almonds, and a peach cobbler cooling on the counter by mid-afternoon. There was no extravagance, only intention. She set 4 places at the table, evenly spaced, each with linen napkins and the good china that had once been reserved for anniversaries. When the doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, Margaret was standing in the foyer, composed, her pearl earrings catching the warm light from the hallway lamp. Ashley entered first, carrying a bottle of sparkling water instead of wine this time, her smile practiced and polite. Daniel followed, scanning the room as though trying to assess the mood. Lily lingered close behind, offering her grandmother a quick, genuine hug that lingered a fraction longer than usual. Margaret led them into the dining room without commentary. They took their seats. The early summer air drifted in faintly through a cracked window, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Conversation began with small talk about school finals and neighborhood construction, but Margaret did not allow it to wander for long. After plates had been served and a few bites taken, she set her fork down deliberately. The soft sound against porcelain was enough to draw their attention. She folded her hands in front of her and looked first at Daniel, then at Ashley. "I understand you have concerns about my future," she said evenly. No accusation colored her tone. No emotion strained her voice. She continued by explaining that she had met with her attorney and reviewed every detail of her estate plan and healthcare directives. She informed them that all decisions regarding her living arrangements, finances, and medical care would remain solely under her authority unless she personally declared otherwise in writing. Daniel shifted in his chair, surprise flickering across his face. Ashley straightened slightly, her expression tightening for just a moment before smoothing again. Margaret did not rush her words. She explained that she had also removed all shared digital access to her accounts and updated her passwords. The room grew noticeably quieter. Lily's eyes moved between her parents and her grandmother, absorbing each sentence. Margaret spoke of independence not as defiance, but as responsibility. She reminded them gently that she had managed a household for more than 40 years, navigated loss, balanced investments, and maintained her health with discipline. "If a time comes when I need assistance," she said calmly, "I will be the one to say so." Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it. Ashley offered a measured comment about only wanting what was best, but the certainty in her voice had softened. Margaret reached for her water glass and took a small sip, allowing the silence to settle. She did not threaten. She did not argue. She simply established boundaries with the same steadiness she had once used to teach Daniel right from wrong. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its headlights briefly gliding across the dining room wall. The house felt solid around them, its history present in every beam and photograph. Margaret looked at her family not with anger, but with clarity. The conversation had shifted, and this time, it had shifted on her terms. No one reached for their fork. After Margaret finished speaking, and the silence that followed felt different from the one at Daniel's house days earlier, because this time it did not belong to surprise, but to recalculation. Ashley adjusted her napkin on her lap with careful fingers, her posture straight, her expression composed but no longer bright. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, as though creating physical distance from a conversation that had just shifted beyond his control. Margaret remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her shoulders relaxed. She did not look defensive. She looked certain. After several seconds, Daniel spoke, his voice measured. He said they had only been trying to anticipate future complications, that stories about elderly homeowners falling or forgetting medications were common. Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze steady but not sharp. She acknowledged that aging required foresight, and she agreed that safety mattered. Then she asked, gently, whether foresight also required secrecy. The question lingered between them. Ashley responded first, explaining that they had toured a community simply to gather information. She described it again, the walking paths, the dining hall, the emergency call buttons in every room. Her words were polished, but the conviction behind them seemed thinner now. Margaret nodded as if considering the features of a hotel rather than a permanent change of life. She told them she had no objection to information. What she objected to was assumption. She reminded them that this house had been paid off for over 20 years, that its wide staircases and solid railings were designed intentionally, that she maintained regular medical appointments and had not missed a single one. She spoke not to defend herself, but to establish record. Lily cleared her throat softly and said that Grandma still walked faster than anyone in the neighborhood. The small comment broke some of the tension, and for a brief moment a faint smile touched Margaret's lips. She reached across the table and squeezed Lily's hand, grateful for the unfiltered honesty of youth. Daniel shifted again and asked whether Margaret would at least consider visiting one of the facilities just to see it. Margaret answered carefully. She said she would consider anything presented transparently and respectfully. But she added that consideration did not equal commitment. The distinction was subtle yet firm. Ashley's gaze moved around the dining room, taking in the framed photographs on the walls, the bookshelf lined with decades of memories, the chandelier Robert had installed himself. Perhaps for the first time, she seemed to recognize that this was not simply square footage to be reassigned. It was history. Margaret rose calmly to bring out the peach cobbler, placing it at the center of the table as though hosting an ordinary gathering. She served each portion evenly, her movements precise and unhurried. The act itself reinforced the message. She was capable, organized, fully present. As dessert plates were passed around, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, though an undercurrent of awareness remained. Something fundamental had been clarified. Margaret had not resisted with anger. She had not pleaded. She had defined terms. When the evening began to wind down and chairs scraped softly against the floor, Daniel stood and hugged his mother, this time holding her a fraction longer than before. Ashley thanked her for dinner, her voice quieter. Lily whispered that she was proud of her. After the front door closed and the house settled back into silence, Margaret gathered the plates and carried them to the kitchen. The night air slipped through the open window, cool and steady. She did not feel triumphant. She felt anchored. The future had not been decided, but one truth had been restored. Any decision about her life would begin with her voice, not end with it. The house felt different after that evening, not because anything physical had changed, but because the air itself seemed clearer, as if a window long sealed had finally been opened, and Margaret moved through the quiet rooms with an ease that had been missing for weeks. She washed the remaining dishes, dried them carefully, and returned each plate to its exact place in the cabinet. The routine grounded her. Outside, the neighborhood had settled into its usual Saturday calm. Porch lights glowing softly along the street, the distant sound of a television drifting from a nearby open window. Margaret turned off the kitchen light and paused in the hallway, her gaze resting on the framed photograph of Robert in his navy blazer, smiling with that steady confidence she had always relied upon. "You would have handled it the same way," she murmured softly, not out of loneliness but out of acknowledgement. The following morning dawned bright and mild. Margaret rose early, tied her walking shoes, and stepped outside for her usual 2-mile route. The air carried the faint scent of lilacs from Mrs. Langley's garden. As she walked, she replayed the previous evening in her mind, not searching for flaws but recognizing progress. Daniel had listened. Ashley had not argued. Lily had spoken without hesitation. The dynamic had shifted, subtly but undeniably. When Margaret returned home, she brewed coffee and opened her leather notebook once more. She reviewed her recent entries and added another line beneath them: maintain strength without resentment. It mattered to her that clarity did not turn into bitterness. Independence did not require hostility. Later that afternoon, her phone chimed with a message from Daniel. He thanked her for dinner. He admitted that he and Ashley had moved too quickly without including her. He said they would respect her decisions moving forward. Margaret read the message slowly, noting the change in tone. There was no defensiveness in the words, only adjustment. She replied with equal calm, writing that she valued open conversations and expected them to continue honestly. She added that when the time came for any transition in her life, she would invite discussion herself. She set the phone aside and looked around the living room. Sunlight streamed across the hardwood floors, illuminating the subtle grain of the wood Robert had once insisted on installing despite the higher cost per square foot. It had been an investment in permanence. Margaret understood now that permanence did not mean resisting change. It meant deciding when change was appropriate. In the weeks that followed, small differences became noticeable. Daniel stopped asking indirect questions about her accounts. Ashley no longer sent articles about senior housing. Instead, they asked about her book club selections and her garden plans for summer. Lily began visiting on her own some Saturday afternoons, helping Margaret plant tomatoes along the back fence and listening to stories about how the house had been built. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices echoing through hallways. The transformation was quiet, rooted in boundaries that had been spoken clearly and calmly. Margaret continued meeting with her attorney to finalize updated documents, not out of fear, but out of prudence. She organized her files, labeled them plainly, and placed them where she alone could access them. Each action reinforced a simple truth. Her life remained hers. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of soft orange and lavender, Margaret sat on her front porch with a glass of iced tea resting on the table beside her. She watched as neighbors walked their dogs and children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. The world moved forward at its usual pace. She felt no urgency to escape it, no pressure to surrender control. Age had given her perspective, not weakness. She had faced the suggestion of being quietly set aside and answered it without anger, without panic, without losing her dignity. In the stillness of that evening, Margaret understood that strength did not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it arrived as a steady tone at a dinner table, as a carefully chosen sentence, as the simple refusal to be erased. And in that understanding, she felt entirely at home.